Right, friends, in today's lesson, we talked about the absolute value of numbers, and we first explored that by having a number talk about numbers that are closer to zero and comparing them. So in this activity, you're mentally to decide which one's closer to zero, and so I'm going to walk through explaining that. So we talked in class today that 9/11 is closer to zero than 15/11 because they have the same denominator. Therefore, we can conclude by comparing them that 9/11 is less than 15/11. That would look like this if you actually wrote that out. Is less than 15/11. On the next one, we had 1/5 and 1/9. We talked about, in this situation, we talked about since they have the different denominators, we would think about like sharing a pizza or sharing a cake. If you invited 5 friends over, each person would get a larger piece of cake versus 9 people, each person would get a smaller one. So this is closer to zero. Another way of thinking about that is you could do division. Someone talked about that. So that would be 1 divided by 9. 9 can't go into that, so you need a decimal and then add a 0. 9 can go into 10 one time, and then it's going to repeat itself, so it's going to be about 11 hundredths. 1/5 is going to be 5 can't go into that, so you added that. It's going to be about, so this, you can see that that's, it's going to work out perfectly. That's 10, so it's really 20 hundredths versus 11 hundredths, and you can see that. On this one, we agreed that this is the same or equal distance to 0. These are our equivalent. And you could do the math, 5 fours, you could 5, 4. 5 goes into that one time, you're left with 1. 5 goes into 10 twice. And then, so you could check your work with that. And then this one, people had some disagreements between, so 100th versus 1,000. So I came to the conclusion that I would let them talk about it. And I asked them, I said, so which one's larger? And so we concluded that 100th is larger than 1,000th. So therefore, since that's larger in that capacity, this one would be closer to 0 because it's smaller, right? Because that would be 1,000 tick marks to 1 whole. This would be 100 tick marks to 1 whole. And so that's what we are trying to get to. So that was the first activity that we did. The second activity that we did is the jumping flea. So we introduced this number line and that things could move on the number line. This ties into what we're going to be doing with negative numbers when we're adding and subtracting. And using this number line is vital to the success of students understanding why when we subtract negatives and add negatives, numbers can change. So this is like the very beginning of that, and I want to make sure that we take the opportunity to explore it for all it's worth. So it says a flea is jumping around on a number line. If the flea starts at 1, so this is 1, and jumps 4 units to the right, that means 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm going to be there. So there's where the flea is. Where does it end up? Well, if we're counting by ones, that's going to be at 5. And so it says, how far away from 0 is this? That is 5 units away from 0. And the reason why we're saying this is because we're really trying to get students to understand this concept of absolute value. So absolute value asks us how far a number is away from 0. And so we really want students to get that. So in B it says if the flea starts at 1 and jumps 4 units to the left. So now here I am back at 1 and I go to the left. 1, 2, 3, 4. I place my little dot there so that I'm going to label this B. That would be -3. And that's 3 units away from 0. And if the flea starts at 0 and jumps 3 units away, where might it land? So if I'm at 0 and I jump 3 this way, I'm at +3. If I jump 3 this way, I'm at -3. So we said -3 and 3, and those are opposites. And we said that an opposite is an opposite because they're the same distance away from 0. So you have a positive and a negative, they're both equally the same distance from 0. That helps us understand opposite, so we need to make sure we have that down. And then the next one, if the flea jumps 7 units and lands at 0, where could it have started? We said -7 and 7. and then it says in E, the absolute value of a number is the distance it is from 0. The flea is currently to the left of 0. So this key term left, anytime you're to the left of 0, you're in a negative number. And it says the absolute value of its location is 4. Where on the number line is it? Well, 4 units to the left of 0 is negative 4. So this would be negative 4, because 4 units to the left of 0 is negative 4. If the flea is to the left of 0, again, that keyword left of 0, and the absolute value of its location is 5, where on the number line is it? That would be negative 5. If the flea is to the right of 0 and the absolute value of its location is 2.5, where on the number line is it? So the keyword here is right of 0. That would be make it a positive number, so that's 2.5. Then moving down here, it says we use the notation the absolute value of negative 2 to say the absolute value of negative 2, which means the distance of negative 2 from 0 on the number line. So, what does the absolute value mean and what is its true? So, the value of this is 7, and this means the absolute value or distance from 0. So this means 7 units away from 0. That's what we're trying to get at. And what does 1 and 8/10, what does the absolute value of 1 and 8/10 mean, and what is its value? Its value is 1 and 8/10, and it's 1 and 8/10 units away from 0. Okay? So that was that activity, and then we did the last activity, which was about elevation and temperature. The first lesson that we opened up with, we were also talking about elevation and temperature in class, and we were saying that positive numbers for elevation will represent above sea level, negative numbers for elevation will represent below sea level, and so now we're adding the understanding of absolute value to that as well. So in this situation, things are going to be a little different and challenge students to really think through what's happening with these numbers, and I think that's important. So for the first one, it says we can use negative 6 feet to describe elevation and the absolute value of negative 6 feet to describe its vertical from sea level. So it's distance from sea level is really what we should say there. In the context of elevation, what would each of the following numbers describe? So in this situation, because it's a positive 25, we know that this is 25 feet above sea level. And the next one is the absolute value of 25 feet, which, or the absolute value of 25, which means that it's 25, it would be 25 feet it would be 25 feet, my mind just stopped. So this represents the absolute value, so 25 feet away from 0, and because we know it's positive on the inside, we know that that's a positive, so above sea level. So we can take that in. Negative 8 feet would represent 8 feet below sea level, and then in this situation, negative 8 feet would represent 8 feet away from 0. Also known as 8 feet away from sea level, or if you're thinking about that, 8 feet below sea level and sea level. So the distance is 8 feet away from 0, or 8 feet away from 0 and sea level. So that negative would indicate that 8 is below sea level. So you're comparing the point 8 feet below sea level to 0, and it's a distance of 8 feet. The elevation of a city is different from sea level by 10 feet. Name the two elevations that the city could have. Well, if we know that they're both 10 feet, and we're talking about 0, so on the opposite sides of 0, that would be negative 10 and 10. Because they're both 10 feet away from sea level, which is 0. We write negative 5 to describe a temperature that is 5 degrees Celsius below freezing point, and 5 degrees Celsius for a temperature that is 5 degrees above freezing. In this context, which do each of the following numbers describe? When we talked about temperature, we said that any positive number above 0 would be above freezing, any number below 0 would be below freezing, and then in the context of absolute value, we would say the distance between the freezing point and the temperature. So this one would be 1 degree Celsius above freezing. This would be 4 degrees Celsius below freezing. This would be distance, so 12 units away from freezing. Also, another way of thinking about that is the distance between that and 0, and then this is 7 units away from freezing. Another way of thinking about that is that's the distance in degrees between the freezing point and negative 7 degrees Celsius. So that's what that represents, that's 7. Which temperature is colder, negative 6 or 3 degrees? Well, we know that if you're comparing these, that negative 6 is less than that, so negative 6 is colder, 6 degrees Celsius. Which temperature is closer to freezing temperature, negative 6 or 3 degrees Celsius? 3 degrees is closer to 0, so we're going to write 3 degrees Celsius. Which temperature has a smaller absolute value? 3 degrees Celsius, because it has a closer distance to 0. So that's what we talked about in class today. So understanding absolute value is just the distance between a point on the number line and 0. And so again, so the biggest point here is that the absolute value of a number is its distance from 0 on the number line. So how far away is that number from 0 on the number line? And it's always written as a positive number. So that is for today, and we will pick this up again tomorrow.